Bigfoot is obviously, I always call the rock star of cryptozoology. Everybody's into it, everyone's interested for obvious reasons. If Bigfoot exists, it would just, I'm sure Daniel will talk about this, it would probably just change the whole world in a pretty dramatic way. But anyways, the field of cryptozoology is actually pretty diverse. What I do is I go out and investigate accounts like Jim of lots of different types of mystery animals. They all interest me. So one of the lesser known, some of the lesser known cryptids, as we call them in the field of cryptozoology, cryptid means mysterious, undocumented animal. There are actually accounts of undocumented amphibians. And since we're doing a giant salamander expedition and a salamander is an amphibian, I figured that would be kind of a nice tie-in to talk about some of those here today. So amphibians are obviously, we think of frogs, toads, newts, salamanders, sirenians. There's about 7,000 species around the world. Most of them are pretty small, and you probably see them every day. The largest amphibian in the world, and of course the name amphibian, as it infers, basically means creature that lives in two worlds. So basically the water, where they, all life came from, but they can also adapt sometimes to a terrestrial or, on land type of existence, or both. And they also have a metamorphosis, right? They usually start out as tadpoles, well, eggs, and then tadpoles, and then they change and morph, and their gills go away, and they change. So that's kind of a cool thing. I've always been into amphibians ever since I was a kid. Collecting spotted salamanders was one of my favorite critters to go out there and find in the woods, and tree frogs and different things like that. So they're very near and dear to my heart. And what I always think of the amphibians in terms of the pioneers of the animal kingdom, because for hundreds of millions of years everything was in the water, and then eventually something crawled onto land, and that was most likely that's kind of where the amphibians started to kind of stake their claim. And of course there are many species still represented here on the planet today. The largest known amphibian is the Chinese giant salamander. Andrias davidianus is the scientific name, and there's also the Japanese giant salamander, Andrias japonicus. And this one can get to be supposedly about 6 feet long. Sadly, like many amphibians around the world, they're critically endangered. And that's kind of the downfall of the amphibian world, is that, or family, is that they seem more susceptible to, man's pollution and habitat change, and even just the slightest change in their environment, and they can radically die out in large numbers. So very sadly, a lot of amphibians around the world are critically endangered. Now, the giant salamanders we're going to investigate, and we'll talk about this in our wrap-up at the end. There are slightly various descriptions, but some of the classic accounts from Northern California that we're looking into, people describe salamanders about this size, at least 5 feet long, and maybe even longer. And there's some dramatic descriptions of them being up to 8 feet long. They are 8 foot 4 inches, or maybe even 12 feet, which probably seems like a stretch. These are habitually aquatic amphibians, meaning they don't come onto land at all, and they pretty much just stay in the water, and they live in fast-running cold water streams in Asia and stuff, which is interesting to us as researchers, because in Northern California the habitat is actually very similar to Japan and China and some of the forests where these animals are found. That said, I don't know if we're necessarily married to the idea that we're looking for a species of Jim also mentioned the hellbenders, of course, which are kind of the North American species of cryptobranchid, which is, what, 2.5, 3 feet long?
About 2 feet.
Smaller, but still, if you saw that, you'd be like, whoa, that's crazy. So, and they look somewhat similar, but a little different. But anyways, so there are about 5,000 new species that are still described every year by scientists. Most of those are very small things. And every once in a while something large and surprising turns up, which is why cryptozoology, why we find a little bit of inspiration in that. But here's an example of an amphibian that was described back in 1992 and has only been seen one time. And it's one of my favorites. This was down in Costa Rica, very close to the border with Panama. Some scientists were out there searching some remote areas and found the ghost frog, Courgaster phasma. And this is the only known photo. It was, like I said, only one time in 1992 they found this thing on a rock near a stream. They recognized that it was distinct, and it's, these guys were obviously amphibian experts, so they could look at all the different species of frogs and say, it was completely white and colorless, and it had these big black eyes. And so they've never found a second one after this. So that would be kind of a bucket list thing for me too, to go down to Costa Rica and look for this little ghost frog. And but anyways, so the potential is there, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, is that even though we're looking for something much bigger, there are amphibians out there, many that have not been documented by science yet. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about the Loch Ness Monster, which might be surprising to you a little bit. And by the way, I do have some copies of my new book, The Essential Guide to the Loch Ness Monster, available. And in that book, I kind of, with all my books, I try to remain objective, and I just present you, the reader, the information, and you can kind of draw your own conclusions. There are different theories with regard to all of these different cryptids, and nobody really knows for sure. It's all speculation, right? But, I'll try to summarize briefly the Loch Ness mystery to you guys. Loch Ness is obviously a loch or a lake in northern Scotland in the Great Glen, which is a volcanic rift that formed, I forget how, I think it was during the Devonian, like 200 or 300 million years ago. And basically it's a very deep lake. It's very narrow. It's about 21 miles long, about 1.5 miles wide at the widest point, but it's at least 754 feet deep in spots, and there have been undocumented readings of over 800 feet. In other words, that's 263 billion cubic feet of water. So you could fit the entire population of Earth, all the humans, in Loch Ness 3 times. So it's a lot of water. And it's also very dark water, because a lot of peat and sediment runs down the steep cliffs into the water, and the sun only penetrates about 10 feet down, and there's just poor visibility, which is one of the things that adds to the mystery of the Loch Ness Monster. Well, there's not, there's a lot of, maybe the lake's not that big, but if you can't see more than 10 feet down, and they've tried to send submarines and cameras and different things down, and it hasn't been very fruitful. There is a lot of sonar evidence, and a lot of people don't realize this, but since 1954, there have been many, many scientific expeditions that have documented large, animate 20 to 30 foot things swimming around deep in Loch Ness, and those have never been explained. A lot of people focus on the photographs, many of which are hoaxed, unfortunately. Some may not be in the video evidence. Loch Ness is an oligotrophic lake, which means it's nutrient poor. It's very cold. It never freezes over, but it maintains a constant temperature of about 47 degrees Fahrenheit. Most of the lake, the deep water. So it's cold water. It's very dark. Because of the lack of sunlight getting through, there's not a lot of algae or plankton, which are the building blocks of an ecosystem. So the smallest things get eaten by the slightly bigger things, and so on and so forth, right? So it's been estimated that there may only be like 20 or 30 tons of fish in Loch Ness. Salmon, trout, eels, lampreys, pike. But, if Loch Ness Monster is a carnivore, it seems like, and especially if there's a bunch of them, and not just one Nessie, right, but a family of Nessies or whatever, theoretically they might not have enough food to eat. So that's been one of the skeptical arguments against. So there have been about 3,000 documented sightings dating back to the 1930s. Pretty consistent. Most people describe big humps that come up in the water, smooth humps like a whale that go up and down. The head and neck sightings, and everyone has this image of the little head with the long neck, those only comprise 15% of Loch Ness Monster sightings. So even though people are infatuated with that, mostly because of something called the surgeon's photo, the famous image that we've all seen, which was proven to be most likely a hoax. So people have that. But anyways, because of that image, most people have tried to equate the Loch Ness Monster to something called a plesiosaur, right? Which is a primitive or a prehistoric marine reptile that had this tiny head and a long neck and a body like a turtle with a long tail. No shell, of course. So that's based mostly on that assumption that you would get that small head, long neck kind of look. So that's one theory that's very popular. Some of my more skeptical Loch Ness investigator cryptozoology friends think it might be a giant eel, but an eel at least 15 feet long, which to me is also a problem because the eel, if you study eels, that would be a totally theoretical situation that an eel could get that big. And then there have been other theories through the years that it was a long neck type of seal. One of my favorite kind of quirky ones, that it's a big sea slug or a mollusk, and that it basically lives in the bottom and it just comes to the top every once in a while and stuff. So anyways, those are some of the more popular theories, and one that I advocate a little bit in my new book is that it could be a mammal, something like a prehistoric whale, like a basilosaur or archaeocete, which was a long snake-like whale that lived 40 million years ago. But one kind of offbeat theory about the Loch Ness Monster, which has been around a long time, is that it might in fact be a giant newt or salamander, much like we're looking for, or an amphibian living in the water. And the main evidence for this is the fact that for years before the Loch Ness Monster was known to the world, and it actually happened in 1933, in May 2nd, 1933 was the first published newspaper article about a sighting of the Loch Ness Monster. That's the first time the name Loch Ness Monster came out in the press, and it created a worldwide frenzy. But the locals knew about Nessie long before 1933, and in fact many of the old-timers apparently referred to it as the salamander. That was the local name for the thing in the loch that nobody knew what it was. It's the salamander. So that was kind of a local secret that a lot of people don't know about. So where did that notion come from? Why were they calling this thing a salamander? Perchance were there sightings way back that people saw something, and that's basically what they considered it to be. This, by the way, is an illustration in one of my books that I had, where I briefly talk about the amphibian. Okay, so where does this notion, when was it first published? Well, there's a very rare pamphlet. If anyone finds a copy in here, please grab it for me, okay? It's probably one of the most hard to find books in the annals of, it's only 18 pages long, but it's called Home of the Loch Ness Monster, and it was written by the guy in the talk named William Horsebuck Lane, who was an exotic kind of big game hunter and stuff, but he wrote a letter in October of 1933 to the local newspaper, the Inverness Courier, once all the Nessie sightings began to appear in the newspaper, and he wrote a letter to the newspaper and said, I think the Loch Ness Monster is a big salamander. And he talked about how he'd seen giant salamanders in Asia, and you know, to him it just kind of made sense, and he kind of put it all together. And the guy on the lower picture there is one of my favorite cryptozoologists, and that is Lieutenant Commander Rupert T. Gould, who was a brilliant man and actually invented some navigation devices that are still used by sailors all over the world today. And he was one of those guys that would probably go on Jeopardy and win like $10 billion. I mean, he was just like a polymath, that's what they call him, right? Guys, a Renaissance man. Knows a lot of stuff about different things. Well, he wrote a book about the Loch Ness Monster in 1934. He actually rented a motorcycle and just rode around the lake for a couple weeks and interviewed all the witnesses. And you know, basically he also agreed with and apparently became friends with W.H. Lane, and basically concurred and agreed with him that, yeah, maybe it sounds like based on all of these descriptions. And by the way, his Loch Ness book, Lieutenant Commander Rupert T. Gould, is also pretty hard to find. I do have a copy. It costs about $100. You can find them now because they're published in 1934. But very, very inspirational in terms of how he lays out the book, because he's very much about the data. This is the sighting. This is exactly what they said. And when you read the book, it's like if you're a researcher, he's not giving you a lot of biased opinion and speculation. It's all, this is what this person said. This is, and then he puts it together in charts and graphs. These are the times of days when they're sighted. These are the colors that are reported. So I don't know. I think it's a very impressive level of methodology, and some cryptozoologists fortunately use that. But anyway, so they both, based on all of the eyewitnesses that they interviewed and stuff, they felt like, well, this thing sounds like what people are describing could be a big amphibian. And one of the most famous sightings that both of them referenced involved this guy on the left who's named Duncan Mcdonald. And in 1880, there was a ship that wrecked and for some reason it was hauling bat guano, which I don't exactly, maybe that's a historical, what did they use it for? Fertilizer? Okay, thank you. So the bunch of bat guano in a boat sunk in Loch Ness in fairly shallow water. And they sent, thank you for that, that's good to know. Duncan Mcdonald was a diver, and this is a 1880s era diving suit. Isn't that the coolest thing you've ever seen in your life? Daniel, I bet you like that, don't you?
I don't know how you'd get back up. It looks super heavy.
They got a hose. The guy obviously got a hose, and they're like pumping oxygen down to the person as they were like walking around in this head. They're obviously not diving. They're probably like walking on the bottom or something. But anyways, Duncan Mcdonald went down in this dive suit in 1880 to investigate or try to salvage this shipwreck. And according to him, he saw a creature, a hideous creature, that was perched on a rocky ledge under the water, not real deep, but maybe like 30 feet underwater. And he said that it had a giant wide head like a frog. And he was so spooked by this thing that he just immediately, immediately as you could come up in that contraption there, I don't know, maybe you pull on the hose or something and get me out of here. And he came up and said that basically he saw this, he was scared by this large unknown animal with a frog-like head. So that's one of the old stories that, let's see, people around the loch were calling it the salamander. This guy sees something with a frog-like head. And then in 1888, about 8 years later, there was another sighting involving another Mcdonald. There's probably a lot of Mcdonalds in Scotland. This was Andrew Mcdonald that claimed he was on a boat and he saw a large animal with 4 stubby limbs and a flat body come up, and he said it looked like a big salamander. So anyways, you get those old salamander stories from Loch Ness, kind of forgotten in time that, that those stories existed. The theory was revived by another hero of cryptozoology, Dr. Roy P. Mackle, who was a biologist at the University of Chicago who became involved in the Loch Ness monster investigation in the late 1960s. Here he is showing off a crossbow he designed with something called a biodart, which he was going to shoot at Nessie and then pull the dart out, and then it has a flesh sample. It captures some of the skin, and so you're able to test it. And so it was pretty ingenious. He never actually got to use it. But Roy also wrote an excellent book on the Loch Ness Monster in 1976, one of the most scientific books, where he looks at all the evidence, the photographs, the eyewitness accounts, and he looks at the biology and stuff. And he basically also revived the idea, and he actually had a chart where he gave each possible candidate of the Loch Ness Monster a score based on different factors, the food source, the physical descriptions, and so forth. And the highest rated, and he suggested possibly giant eel, possibly mammal, possibly plesiosaur, but the highest rated score on his chart was 88%. That Nessie must be an amphibian. So he actually favored the amphibian, and furthermore, he went on to go ahead and mention the fact that there were prehistoric amphibians, the largest known prehistoric amphibians, and Pholidurpaton atei, which lived during the age of the amphibians was the Carboniferous, which was about 300 million years ago. And there were a lot of amphibians around that time, and this, from fossils that this particular mostly aquatic or habitually aquatic amphibian reached a length of 15 feet. So at least we have an example of a 15-foot amphibian in the fossil record.
We've got examples of 30-foot fossil amphibians.
Are there 31?
Yeah, Primazuchus, which was a Triassic amphibian from Argentina.
Okay. Well, okay, so he just upped me. He doubled me up to 30. Isn't there some ambiguity, though, Jim, as far as, the bridge between amphibians and primitive reptiles? So
there
I think that's
is.
part of, when did that transition actually occur? But
there
no,
is.
Fair point. Okay, so amphibians could theoretically get big. And actually, the Carboniferous period, 300 million years ago, the climate was actually very similar to what it is today. So it wasn't dramatically different in terms of the earth temperatures and humidity and those types of things. So anyways, that was kind of his theory. So Nessie the Newt is what I love. And there's actually a modern researcher named Steve Plambeck, and he's got a website called the Loch Ness Salamander that you can go to, and he'll have all this information. But this is his chart of a theoretical, what he thinks the Loch Ness Monster as a giant salamander could look like. And he's got size and scale there in terms of a diver. Boy, that's pretty scary if, that comes up behind you and you can see some of it. So anyways, the Loch Ness Monster, who knows what it is. But if it exists, maybe it is an amphibian. Now, the one last thing I'd like to add, there's two factors that make it rate higher than a lot of the other animal groups, or particularly plesiosaur. One is that amphibians, as a general rule, can adapt better to the cold than reptiles can. Okay, I said earlier the Japanese and Chinese giant salamanders are found in cold water. You have certain species of frogs and toads and newts and things that live even up in Alaska that actually can somehow. So that's one thing. Reptiles don't adapt as well to cold water, generally speaking. They're not going to do well there. And also, amphibians can breathe underwater through their skin. It's called cutaneous respiration. They can actually absorb and exchange the oxygen through their skin. So whereas a plesiosaur or other animal you'd expect would be constantly coming to the surface of Loch Ness and gulping for air, right? Or at least every few minutes or so. How long can a crocodile hold their breath? Like 10 minutes? 15?
Depends on the temperature of the water.
Okay. Well, not as long as... Anyways. So that's one of the cool theories about, if the Loch Ness Monster was an amphibian, maybe it lives deep down and it just doesn't have to come to the surface very often. So, there's two pretty fair arguments you could make for an amphibian over a reptile. So anyways. Okay. So the next one is kind of weird, but it's called the Loveland Frog. Has anyone ever heard of this? It's from, Loveland, Ohio, just outside of Cincinnati. I've actually been to the location one time years ago. Really weird. Okay. So the story actually dates back to 1955 and actually begins in UFO lore, which I'm sure will interest Daniel, but there was a UFO investigator named Leonard Stringfield who used to document sightings back in the 50s. And he and a local colleague, a guy named Ted Blocher, actually heard some stories, and it's originally known as the incident under the bridge in UFO lore, or the trolls. And according to the story that came out in some of these old UFO journals and stuff, there was a truck driver that claimed he had been driving through Loveland, Ohio, and he saw 4 tiny man-like figures standing about 3 feet tall, acting weird under a bridge. And when he rolled down his window, there was a strong, offensive, sulfur smell, or alfalfa is what he originally said, which, I don't know, alfalfa surely doesn't smell as bad as sulfur. Anyways, that was the description. And so they, Stringfield and Blocher went to Loveland to interview this trucker, and he kind of shut down and said, oh, yeah, I didn't see anything weird. It was just 4 humanoids that were 3 feet tall under a bridge acting weird. It wasn't, which to me, that would be kind of weird either way. But anyways, he kind of dropped. He didn't want to talk. But a local police chief there told them that there was another guy that claimed he had also seen these troll-like creatures on a different night. So they went and interviewed the guy. His name is Robert Honeycutt, and he was a businessman. And for some reason, he was driving home at 4 in the morning, just outside of Loveland, Ohio. And he said he pulled up, and there were these 3 little figures squatting by the side of the road. And he said that they at first he thought they were humans and that there might have been a car accident, so he slowed his car down. But as he got a better look, he said they were about 3 feet tall, and he said they had gray skin and they were wearing gray jumpsuits. And he said they had frog-like mouths with no lips, very wide. I don't remember the nostrils. Human-like eyes with no eyebrows, and the hair looked like it was like a doll's, plastic doll's hair that was painted on their heads, which is a pretty weird description. And he also smelled the bad smell. And he says that one of them was holding up a black rod-like object that was shooting sparks. So it's all pretty weird. And he said they began to approach his car and point at him, and then he blacked out. And the next thing he knew, he was waking up and driving to the police station to report it an hour later. So that was the story. So the original drawing of the Loveland Frog, this is a sketch that was done, fast forward to 1972, all the way from 1955 to 1972. On March 3rd of 1972, late at night, local police sheriff's deputy named Ray Shockey was on patrol, and he said as he was coming across the very near to the Little Miami River, which is right there in Loveland, he saw what he thought was an animal squatted on the side of the road. And when he pulled up on it, he said it stood up and it walked across the road and jumped over a guardrail into the river. And he had, I can't remember if it was, I think it was his sister, because he couldn't draw, So he described it to his sister, and this is the original sketch of the Loveland Frog, and he said it looked like it had a frog-like head, no tail, and it was walking on its hind legs, and it was only about like 3 feet tall. So, that's pretty weird, obviously. And then he told apparently one of his fellow officers, a guy named Mark Matthews, and then March 14th, about 11 days later, Matthews was on patrol about the same time, late at night, roughly the same area, and he also saw what he thought was roadkill, and when he pulled up on it, he said it stood up, squatted at him, went over to the guardrail, and Matthews apparently pulled out his gun and fired at the thing, as he, wanted to, I guess, prove whatever this thing was, or maybe he felt intimidated, and but it got away and went down into the river. So those are the classic cases from the 1970s. We have 2 police officers basically coming out and saying they saw this little frog-like creature walking on 2 legs. By the way, there are no known amphibians that walk on 2 legs that I can see. So that's it's like the creature from the Black Lagoon or something. It's kind of fun. And who knows if the 1955 troll stories tie into it. And then there was in 2016, you guys may remember this, but there was a Pokemon Loveland Frog controversy because according to the story, there were some people playing Pokemon, which I don't admittedly know much about, but they're going and looking for Pikachu or one of those characters on their app. And they were down by a little lake next to Loveland, and they claimed they took this picture of a large frog-like animal with big eyes looking at them. Well, subsequently, this was revealed to be a hoax. So, a bit disappointing that this is not actually the Loveland Frog, evidently. Prior to that, in 2014, a local musician from Loveland wrote a Loveland Frog musical, and that debuted at a local theater. And I would love to see that musical to see what kind of spin they put on the Loveland Frog. Anyways, so in the in 2016, after the Pikachu incident, one of the surviving police officers, Mark Matthews, made a public statement and said that the whole Loveland Frog story had been misconstrued. And actually, what he shot at that night was an escaped iguana that was missing its tail, that was about 3 feet long. Now, that doesn't really, in my mind, explain why it was walking on 2 legs. And, iguanas can lose their tail. I guess lots of reptiles can, for whatever reason, in an accident or whatever. And he said the Loveland Frog doesn't exist. It was just an iguana. He claims he did shoot it, but he just didn't want to announce to the press because he thought people might react badly to that. But he said he examined the body and it was a dead 3-foot iguana that he guessed escaped from somebody or whatever. And that it didn't exist, and neither does Bigfoot. He had to add that extra jab in at the end of his story. Now, my tiny claim to the Loveland Frog mystery is that I went back and looked at the weather reports for March 3rd and March 14th, 1972. And guess what the temperature was in Loveland Frog on those nights? 37 degrees Fahrenheit. Guys, there's no way an iguana would be running around anywhere in 37 degrees in the snow. They're cold-blooded, ectothermic animals. They're very lethargic by nature anyways, but if you drop the temperature down to 37 degrees,
You got an iguanasicle.
you're gonna, yeah, iguanasicle. Very good, man. Fist bump for that one. It's not good. So, I don't know. So my personal feeling is that maybe Mark Matthews, and I've experienced this with other cryptid witnesses, famous cryptid witnesses who were in the newspapers back in the 60s and 70s that claimed they saw Bigfoot or whatever, and I've contacted them in recent years and they were like, I don't talk about that anymore. Or, that didn't happen, no, I'm not, So my theory on that is that people basically just want to disassociate themselves from the phenomenon because it makes them look, kind of wacky or whatever. So I don't know, maybe not. But I think Matthews, this is my feeling, is that when Loveland Frog got back in the news and his name was being mentioned and he's probably retired, I'm sure he's retired now, and he probably just thought, man, I'm just so tired of this Loveland Frog story, I'm just going to kill it and put it to rest. Hey, just my theory, but I think that's why he made up the story about the iguana running across the road. Not saying that I necessarily advocate the existence of a 3-foot bipedal, half frog, half man. There are, if you check out my book, A Menagerie of Mysterious Beasts, there are some other eyewitness accounts that are less known about the Loveland Frog. There was a local farmer that claimed he saw 3 of them on his property. There was a lady who saw something on her doorstep that appeared, and so there are a few ambiguous stories of the Loveland Frog, but Loveland is in truth a charming little community, and it's just, to me, I love the irony that you got this nice little sleepy community outside of Cincinnati that's associated with this weird troll frog-like creature. But, okay, and we have some other cryptid frogs as well. This is known as the Coleman frog or the Fredericton frog, which is a allegedly mounted specimen that is at a museum in Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada, up there in northeast Canada. And it's at the museum to this day. This is what it looks like. And apparently the museum curators will not let anyone take a sample or do DNA testing or anything. They claim that it's a 40-pound frog. Okay? The story behind this is, and we'll go back to the picture, there was a local guy named Fred Coleman who claims that in 1889 he was out in a fishing boat on a little lake there called Killarney Lake, and that this frog jumped into his boat and basically just stayed and didn't leave, and he just left it alone, and he took it back to shore and basically just kind of adopted this frog and began to raise it. And he, according to the story, ordered a special book from France that explained in directions how to raise big frogs and how to fatten them up and get I don't know. This is just a story, guys. I'm just the messenger. And so he apparently religiously fed this frog a diet of June bugs, buttermilk, and whiskey. That was his secret ingredients that he used to fatten up this frog to 40 or 50 pounds. This is allegedly a photo of him with the frog when it was alive. 42 pounds. And then in 1959, the frog apparently died in a tragic dynamite accident. So that's like a whole nother can of worms. I don't know if we want to open that, but that's can of worms. That's a nice little play on the frog thing. Apparently the frog went swimming out in the lake and someone was throwing dynamite out. I don't know. But anyways, it's in my book, Menagerie Mysterious Beast. And in 1959, the frog, after it got killed, and I guess the dynamite didn't blow it into little bits because Fred Coleman took it down to Maine and had it taxidermied and mounted. And then in 1959, near the end of his life, it was discovered in one of his relatives' attics, and then they gave it to a local hotel in Fredericton where it was on display in the hotel lobby for years and years. And sadly, people were using it as an ashtray and just basically like putting their cigarettes out in this big frog. So maybe it's been touched up in the meantime. But now it's in a museum in Fredericton, and obviously a lot of people think that it has been fabricated out of paper mache and different materials. It's been repainted supposedly since back in the day. But again, the local museum owners, for obvious reasons, because I'm sure this is a big attraction at their museum, they don't want anyone to prove definitively what it is or isn't, but kind of a fun story. There's also a weird story about giant frogs, or what were referred to as toads. Slight distinction there, from China, and particularly in and around the city of Wuhan, which for unfortunate reasons has become well known to all of us. There are some deep water pools, and according to an article that came out in a Chinese newspaper in 1987 and was later disseminated worldwide in American and Australian newspapers, there was a team of scientists from the university, from Peking University in Beijing, that were basically doing biological surveys at some of these deep unexplored pools near Wuhan, China. Very beautiful, by the way. I think some of these would be kind of ideal. I know you guys are James Bond fans, but The Man with the Golden Gun, which is one of my favorites, he's kind of in this remote. Anyways, I digress. But according to the story, they were setting up their gear alongside the lake, and suddenly these three giant creatures came up from the depths, and they described them as being white in color, about 6 feet wide, so like this table, and with frog-like heads. And so they were completely shocked and didn't know what these things were, obviously. And then the story gets a little bit more dramatic, and one of these giant frogs or toads evidently unfurled its long tongue and wrapped it around their camera tripod and dragged the camera rig, tripod and all, into the lake. So kind of a sensational story. Oh, and going back in time, there are apparently legends of a giant frog or giant frogs or toads in that lake going back to the 1960s, 1962. According to the locals, they used these giant frogs or toads would come out of the lake and menace them and threaten them. And so once again, dynamite comes into play, and they were basically chunking dynamite in the lake to try to kill this. And one of the frogs came out, and for whatever reason, they gave it a name, Chan. And Chan the frog basically terrorized the town. And so that was the first 1962 sighting. And then you have the 1988 incident. So I don't know. I'm not necessarily swearing to the veracity of any of these stories, but you know, these are some of the stories that are floating around out there. Floating around, get it? That's another word. Okay. So how big do frogs or toads get? Which is a perfectly reasonable explanation. Well, the largest species on Earth is the African Goliath toad, which I think can be like 1.5 feet long and maybe weigh up to 7 pounds. There was a recent discovery in Madagascar of a fossil, a Cretaceous, when the dinosaurs were around, last around, species of frog. See how he's eating a little dinosaur? Isn't that cool? That's probably my favorite part of the photo. And this guy was named Beelzebufo ampingri. Beelzebufo in Latin means devil frog. And again, it was really not any bigger than the Goliath. I think it was probably about as big as the African bullfrog or the Goliath frog. So we don't have anywhere in the fossil record, correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, there are no frogs or toads that are really mammoth in proportions.
Nothing monstrous.
Nothing monstrous. I mean, that's, you know, you probably wouldn't want to run across one of these. I don't know, maybe not. But and so I personally have only done a couple of cryptid amphibian expeditions, investigations before the one that's coming up this week, which I'm very excited about. One of the ones I looked into was at a place called Silver Lake in Massachusetts. And Silver Lake is about an hour northwest of Boston. And I read about it, I think, in some of Lauren Coleman's books and maybe some other crypto books, just very vague references to a giant frog that lives in Silver Lake, Massachusetts. So in 2009, October of 2009, I actually traveled up to Boston to see our mutual friend Nick Redfern and Lauren Coleman speak at a conference up there. And then I had a day off, and since I had a rental car, I thought, well, man, I want to go investigate these giant frog stories from Silver Lake. And actually, it was a toss-up because there was also something called the Dover Demon, which was reported just south of Boston. And I was like, oh man, the Dover Demon, that's kind of, but yeah, I'll go look for the giant frog. But so I spent a day, and it was a Sunday, so a lot of the businesses were closed. It was a beautiful area. There was lots of beautiful, the foliage was turning, and I didn't really take picture, but there were lots of really fancy houses along the lake shore, so you could tell it was kind of an upscale area. I didn't really feel confident enough to knock on people's doors and ask them if there was a giant monster frog in the lake. Not that I won't do that other times. There have been many times on Bigfoot investigations where I've just cold knocked on a door and said, did you know there was a Bigfoot sighting on this property 20 years ago or whatever. So I have done that before, but I didn't really want to knock on any of the houses because they were big and fancy, and I was like, okay, I look kind of weird out here. But there were some people hanging out. There's a park, and there were some guys fishing off the dock. And so I went and talked to them and some other people in the park, walked the whole circumference of the lake. It's not very big. And I just asked all these people, have you ever heard a story about a giant frog in your lake? And not a single person knew anything about what I was talking about. So it was kind of a disappointment in terms of, you know, whether there's a frog or a toad. But, you know, who knows? I mean, a lot of these could be like urban legend type stories. There's been speculation that sometimes big catfish, and Jim was talking about, you know, big catfish that can get up, invasive catfish or whatever, that sometimes their head looks kind of frog-like if you see them in the right, you know, when they're coming up at you out of the water or stuff. So maybe that could be one possible explanation. And then finally, and this is a real throwback for me, this is me at age 14, obviously with the Matterhorn in Switzerland behind me. So in 1982 at age 14, my father and I took a bus tour around Switzerland, and we spent a couple of days hiking through the Alps. And I got interested in cryptozoology when I was about 8 or 9 years old. It's been a lifelong obsession of mine. So I knew when I went to the Swiss Alps in 1982 that there was a creature called the Topsail Worm, or the spring worm. And this is a depiction of it on the bottom here, which actually appeared in an old Bavarian hunting guide. And the Topsail Worm is said to be a long, mostly limbless animal. It's said that it has 2 limbs in the front, perhaps, scaly body and a blunt head, or some people say it has a cat-like head, which is why you see that other old depiction up there. Very aggressive. The name spring worm, as it implies, is that this animal basically lives in crevices and rocks at altitude, and that it actually will spring out at people and attack people or small animals when they walk by. And there are also stories that it may actually be venomous too. So that's kind of the story of the Topsail Worm. The most recent documented account that I'm aware of is only from the 1920s. So it's mostly an old cryptid that we heard about a lot in the late 19th century, early 20th, I'm sorry, late 20th century, early 20th century. So I don't know. I didn't find the Topsail Worm, but I spent a lot of time kind of hiking through the Alps and looking. I guess I wasn't too scared of it springing out at me and looking in crevices of rocks. Now, why I bring this up now, there are various theories as to what the Topsail Worm, if it exists, what it could be. One possibility is that it could be a reptile, and you have basically what are known as legless lizards, Chapultics. Did I say that right? Chapultic? Anyways, they live in high altitude. They're not snakes, they're lizards, but they don't have any legs. And unlike snakes, they actually have eyelids, so they can blink. And their head looks like more lizard shaped if you've seen one. I've gotten to hold one before. They're typically not very big. They're only about like maybe 1.5 feet long. So one of the theories is maybe the Topsail Worm, if it exists, could be one of the, maybe a larger version. Because the Topsail Worm was typically described as being about 3 feet long. But maybe the Topsail Worm was some type of legless lizard. Or some, because it was said to be venomous, maybe it could be related to the Gila monster or other venomous lizard. But there is one other suggestion or theory about the Topsail Worm, which is that it actually may be an amphibian. What kind of amphibian? I don't know if I'd be fair to speculate. Maybe something like a Chinese or Japanese giant salamander, because they also, even though they're in the water and are aquatic, they typically live in elevation, or that's what they prefer. They like these fast-running glacial mountain streams and creeks and stuff. So, kind of a Swiss version of what we may be searching for this weekend. Okay, so with that, I guess I'm going to wrap up my lecture. Thank you for your time. We've got one more excellent presenter here, and then we're going to, like I said, we're going to all get up here as a group and talk about the giant salamander expedition at the very end. So we'll give you guys another break of about 10 or 15 minutes.
That sounds good.
Huh?
15
minutes if you need to stretch your legs or use the bathroom. And
go be sure to check out all the books that's got on the table.
Thank you guys. I do have books available over here.